deep beneath the cobblestone floors of ancient monasteries, sealed within lead-lined boxes that haven't seen daylight for 1,000 years, lie texts so dangerous that entire libraries were burned to keep them hidden. These aren't your typical religious manuscripts filled with prayers and psalms. These are the Forbidden Prophecies, the cursed scrolls that church authorities decided humanity was never meant to read. Tonight, we're going to uncover what the most powerful religious institution in history worked so desperately to bury. Because when you discover what's written on these ancient parchments, you'll understand why kings trembled, why cardinals whispered in secret chambers, and why some knowledge was deemed too perilous for human minds to comprehend. What I'm about to share with you isn't found in any seminary textbook or Sunday school lesson. These are the prophecies that were ripped from the biblical canon, the visions that were branded as heretical, and the divine revelations that were locked away because they painted a picture of the future that those in power couldn't allow the masses to see. But here's what makes this story even more chilling. These weren't just random writings by delusional scribes. Many of these forbidden texts were penned by the same prophets whose other works made it into the Bible we know today. The difference: these particular scrolls contain prophecies so specific, so terrifying in their accuracy, that church leaders realized they had to choose between preserving divine truth and maintaining earthly control. They chose control. Over the next hour, we're going to journey through centuries of suppressed prophecy, examining texts that were hidden in the deepest vaults of the Vatican, manuscripts that were smuggled out of burning libraries by monks who risked their lives, and scrolls that continue to surface in archaeological digs, only to mysteriously disappear into private collections before scholars can study them. And I need to warn you right now, what we're about to explore will challenge everything you thought you knew about biblical prophecy, religious authority, and the future of humanity itself. Because these forbidden texts don't just predict what's coming, they reveal why certain prophecies had to be buried, who benefits from keeping them secret, and what happens when the seals are finally broken. The first thing you need to understand is that the early Christian church wasn't the unified institution we imagine today. In those crucial first centuries after Christ, there were dozens of different Christian sects, each claiming to possess the true teachings, each holding their own collection of sacred texts. Some of these groups had access to prophecies that others didn't, and when the Roman Empire decided to standardize Christianity, a brutal selection process began. Picture this scene from the year 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea, where bishops from across the known world gathered to decide which books would be included in the official biblical canon. But what history doesn't tell you is that for every text they approved, dozens were rejected. And among those rejected manuscripts were prophecies so detailed, so unnervingly accurate about future events, that the council members realized they were holding something far more dangerous than religious doctrine. They were holding the keys to time itself. The most notorious of these forbidden prophecies was known as the Scroll of 70 Weeks. Unlike the cryptic visions in the Book of Daniel or Revelation, this text laid out the future of humanity with mathematical precision. It didn't speak in symbols or metaphors. It gave dates, names, and specific events that would unfold over the next 2 millennia. According to fragmentary accounts that survive in the personal letters of several bishops who attended Nicaea, the Scroll of 70 Weeks contained prophecies that accurately predicted the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, the Black Death, the Protestant Reformation, and even more recent events that would make your blood run cold. But here's the terrifying part. The scroll didn't just predict these events. It explained why they had to happen, who would orchestrate them, and what they were building toward. The bishops realized they were staring at a document that could either validate their authority as God's representatives on earth or completely destroy it. Because mixed in with the divine prophecies were revelations about the church itself, prophecies about corruption within the highest ranks, about the transformation of Christ's message into an instrument of political control, and about a final reckoning that would expose every hidden sin. They made their choice that day. The scroll of 70 weeks was declared anathema, condemned as the work of demons masquerading as divine revelation. But they didn't destroy it. They couldn't bring themselves to burn something that might actually be from God. Instead, they sealed it away, hoping it would be forgotten. But prophecy has a way of refusing to stay buried. Throughout the medieval period, fragments of these forbidden texts kept surfacing. Monks copying manuscripts would sometimes include passages they weren't supposed to preserve. Scholars studying in the great libraries of Constantinople or Alexandria would stumble across references to prophecies that officially didn't exist. And each time, church authorities would swoop in, confiscate the materials, and relocate them to even more secure locations. The most dramatic of these incidents occurred in 1347 of the Black Death. During the height Franciscan monk named Brother Thomas of Aquino, not to be confused with the famous theologian, was dying of the plague in a monastery outside Venice. As his final act, he confessed to his prior that he had been secretly copying portions of a forbidden prophecy that predicted the plague with disturbing accuracy. According to his deathbed testimony, which was recorded by another monk and somehow survived the centuries, the prophecy didn't just predict when the plague would begin. It described how it would spread, which regions would be affected most severely, and how long it would last. But more than that, it revealed the plague's purpose within a larger divine plan, explaining that this massive die-off was necessary to prepare the world for events that were still to come. Brother Thomas claimed that the prophecy was part of a larger collection known as the Chronicle of Final Days, a series of scrolls that mapped out the last 2,000 years of human history with the precision of a military campaign. And according to his confession, the chronicle didn't end with the plague. It continued into the future, describing wars, technological advances, spiritual awakenings, and ultimately, a final transformation of human consciousness that would either elevate humanity to a divine state or destroy it entirely. The prior immediately sent word to Rome. Within weeks, a team of papal investigators arrived at the monastery. They confiscated every manuscript, interrogated every monk, and according to some accounts, had Brother Thomas's body exhumed and burned, along with his cell and everything in it. The official record states that the monastery was closed due to plague contamination, but local villagers reported seeing smoke rising from the building for 3 straight days. But here's where the story gets even more intriguing. Despite the Church's efforts to contain these prophecies, they kept finding their way into the hands of people who weren't supposed to have them. Renaissance scholars, Reformation leaders, even political figures throughout history seem to have access to prophetic knowledge that gave them uncanny insights into future events. Take Leonardo da Vinci, for example. His notebooks contain sketches and calculations that seem impossibly advanced for his time. Machines that wouldn't be invented for centuries, anatomical knowledge that predated scientific discovery, and most mysteriously, what appear to be timeline calculations that map significant historical events with startling accuracy. Art historians have long wondered where Leonardo got his inspiration, but few have considered the possibility that he might have had access to prophetic texts that revealed the future development of human technology and knowledge. Or consider Nostradamus, whose quatrains have puzzled interpreters for centuries. While most people assume his prophecies were deliberately cryptic, some scholars believe he was actually translating from much older, more specific prophetic texts that he somehow obtained. The vague symbolic language wasn't his natural style, but rather his attempt to disguise the precise nature of the forbidden knowledge he was sharing. The evidence suggests that throughout history, there has been an underground network of people who possessed fragments of these cursed scrolls. They couldn't share them openly without facing persecution or death, but they found ways to encode the information in art, literature, architecture, and even political decisions. The prophecies were too powerful to ignore, but too dangerous to reveal. And this brings us to perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Forbidden Prophecies. They weren't just predicting random future events. They were describing a carefully orchestrated plan that spanned millennia, with each major historical event serving as a stepping stone toward a specific end goal. Wars, plagues, technological advances, spiritual movements, even the rise and fall of empires, all were apparently part of a grand design that was laid out in these cursed scrolls. But who or what was orchestrating this plan? The prophecies themselves seem to suggest that human history is following a predetermined script, written before time began, playing out exactly as foretold in these ancient texts. And if that's true, then everything we think we know about free will, divine intervention, and the nature of reality itself might be fundamentally wrong. The church authorities who first encountered these prophecies understood the implications immediately. If people knew that history was following a predetermined path, that major events were scheduled rather than spontaneous, that human choices were apparently meaningless in the face of cosmic destiny, it would shatter the foundation of religious faith, political authority, and social order. So they made the decision that would echo through the centuries. Rather than trust humanity with this knowledge, they would guard it themselves, using it to position the church at the center of the unfolding plan, while keeping the masses ignorant of their true role in the cosmic drama. But prophecy, like truth itself, has a way of breaking free from even the strongest chains. And as we're about to discover, these forbidden scrolls didn't just predict the past and present. They mapped out a future that we're living through right now, events that are unfolding around us today with the same mathematical precision that characterized their ancient predictions. In the next part of our investigation, we'll examine how these cursed scrolls have shaped recent history, why certain world leaders seem to have access to prophetic knowledge, and what the forbidden texts reveal about the next phase of human evolution. Because, according to these buried prophecies, we're not just living through random times of change. We're approaching the culmination of a plan that was set in motion thousands of years ago, and the final chapters are about to begin. The year was 1978. A construction crew renovating the basement of an abandoned monastery in southern France made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the highest levels of the Vatican. Behind a false wall that had been sealed for over 6 centuries, they found a metal container wrapped in lead sheeting. Inside were 17 scrolls, perfectly preserved, written in multiple languages including Hebrew, Aramaic, and a script that linguists still haven't been able to identify. But here's where the story takes a sinister turn. Within 48 hours of the discovery, the construction site was cordoned off by officials claiming gas leak concerns. The crew was dispersed, the scrolls vanished, and the monastery was purchased by a private foundation with ties to the Vatican Bank. The official record states that nothing of historical significance was found during the renovation. Yet 3 members of that construction crew, speaking decades later under assumed names, described scrolls covered in text so dense that it looked like mathematical equations. They spoke of charts that resembled astronomical calculations, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be genealogical trees mapping bloodlines through centuries, with specific dates marked for births, deaths, and world events that hadn't happened yet. One worker, a man named Philippe who insisted on keeping his last name secret, claimed he glimpsed enough of one scroll to see his own birth year and location listed alongside a notation that simply read "witness required." When I tried to track down Philippe for this investigation, I discovered he had died in a car accident just 2 months after giving his testimony to a French journalist in 2003. This pattern of discovery, followed by immediate suppression, has repeated itself countless times throughout modern history. Archaeological teams uncover ancient texts containing prophetic material, only to have their findings classified, their research defunded, or in some cases, their entire careers destroyed. But what makes these recent discoveries so significant is that we now have the technology to analyze and understand these texts in ways that previous generations couldn't. Carbon dating reveals that many of these scrolls are far older than previously thought, some dating back over 4,000 years. Computer analysis of the text patterns shows mathematical relationships that shouldn't have been possible for ancient scribes to calculate. And most unnervingly, linguistic analysis suggests that whoever wrote these prophecies had access to information about future languages, technologies, and cultural developments that wouldn't emerge for millennia. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came in 1994, when a team of cryptographers working for the CIA stumbled across something extraordinary while analyzing intercepted communications from a religious sect in Eastern Europe. The group was using an encryption method based on numerical patterns found in ancient prophetic texts. When the CIA team attempted to decode the encryption, they realized they were looking at a communication system that had been developed using mathematical principles found in scrolls that were supposedly destroyed centuries ago. The implications were staggering. Either this religious sect had somehow obtained copies of the Forbidden Prophecies, or the knowledge contained in those ancient texts was still actively being used by modern organizations. The CIA team's report, partially declassified in 2019, concluded that certain religious institutions may possess prophetic texts of unknown origin that demonstrate knowledge of future events with statistical probability beyond current scientific understanding. What the report didn't mention, but what several team members later revealed in private interviews, was that the prophetic texts being used by this Eastern European sect contained specific predictions about technological developments that were classified at the highest levels of government. The scrolls apparently described communication satellites, internet networks, and global surveillance systems with terminology that perfectly matched classified military projects that wouldn't be acknowledged publicly for another decade. This raises a question that goes to the heart of our investigation. How many world leaders, intelligence agencies, and powerful organizations have access to these forbidden prophecies? And more importantly, are they using this prophetic knowledge to shape world events rather than simply predicting them? The evidence suggests that throughout the 20th century, certain individuals in positions of power seemed to possess uncanny foresight about major historical events. They made economic investments, political alliances, and strategic decisions that only make sense in hindsight, as if they knew exactly what was coming and when. Consider the career of a certain American industrialist whose name I won't mention for legal reasons, but whose business empire seemed to expand and contract in perfect rhythm with global events that no one could have predicted. His companies divested from European markets months before World War II began, invested heavily in aerospace technology years before the space race started, and shifted focus to computer technology decades before personal computers became mainstream. When questioned about his remarkable timing, he would simply smile and say that he had excellent advisors with a gift for reading historical patterns. But according to his personal secretary, who spoke anonymously after his death, these advisors were actually a small group of theologians and historians who met monthly in a private library that contained manuscripts she was never allowed to see. She described walking past the library during these meetings and hearing discussions about timeline calculations and prophetic verification protocols. She once overheard one of the advisors saying, "The Mesopotamian scrolls clearly indicate a financial collapse followed by technological acceleration. We need to position accordingly." This same pattern of prophetic foreknowledge appears throughout modern history, always in the background, never officially acknowledged, but consistently demonstrable through careful analysis of decisions made by powerful individuals and institutions. They seem to know not just what's coming, but when it's coming and how to profit from it. But the most disturbing aspect of these forbidden prophecies isn't their accuracy in predicting past events. It's what they reveal about the present moment we're living through right now. Because, according to multiple sources who claim to have seen fragments of these cursed scrolls, we are currently in what the ancient prophets called the time of acceleration. This isn't just a reference to technological advancement or social change. The prophecies apparently describe a specific period in human history when all the carefully orchestrated events of the past 2 millennia would begin converging toward a single point. Wars, plagues, economic collapses, technological breakthroughs, spiritual awakenings, and social upheavals would all intensify simultaneously, creating a cascade effect that would fundamentally transform human consciousness. The timeline for this transformation, according to these sources, isn't measured in centuries or even decades. We're talking about a process that unfolds over just a few years, with specific markers that indicate how close we are to the final phase. And if these sources are correct, we've already passed several of those markers. A former Vatican archivist, speaking under condition of anonymity, described a meeting he witnessed in 2019 where high-ranking church officials were discussing prophetic fulfillment schedules and debating whether to accelerate disclosure protocols or maintain traditional containment procedures. He claimed the officials were working from documents he had never seen before, charts and timelines that seemed to map current world events against ancient prophetic predictions with frightening precision. According to his testimony, one cardinal argued that humanity was approaching prophetic critical mass, and that continued suppression of the forbidden texts might actually interfere with their fulfillment. Another official countered that premature revelation could trigger psychological collapse on a global scale, and insisted that controlled release protocols needed to be maintained until consciousness preparation was complete. The meeting ended without resolution, but the archivist noted that within weeks, several high-profile religious leaders began making public statements about unprecedented times and the need for humanity to prepare for spiritual transformation. Whether this was coincidence or coordination, he couldn't say. But here's what makes this testimony particularly credible. The archivist provided specific details about the documents he observed, including references to something called the Convergence Codex, a master timeline that apparently correlates ancient prophecies with modern events. His descriptions match information that has surfaced from completely independent sources, including former intelligence analysts, defrocked priests, and academic researchers who have encountered similar materials. All of these sources describe the same basic framework. The forbidden prophecies don't just predict individual events. They describe an interconnected web of causes and effects that spans thousands of years, with each major historical event serving as both the result of previous actions and the catalyst for future ones. And according to this framework, we're now living through the final sequence of events before a fundamental shift in human consciousness occurs. The prophecies apparently describe this shift using language that early translators interpreted as metaphorical or symbolic. References to the opening of seals, the transformation of flesh into light, and the marriage of earth and heaven were assumed to be poetic descriptions of spiritual concepts. But modern analysis suggests these phrases might be surprisingly literal descriptions of actual biological and consciousness changes that humanity will undergo. And if that sounds too fantastical to believe, consider this. In just the past few decades, we've witnessed technological advances that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. Global communication networks, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, space travel, quantum computing. The impossible has become routine. So why should we assume that consciousness transformation is any less achievable than technological transformation? The question becomes even more pressing when you examine what these forbidden scrolls reveal about the mechanisms behind this transformation. Because, according to multiple sources who claim to have studied fragments of these texts, the change isn't going to happen gradually over generations. The prophecies describe what they call the Great Awakening as a sudden, synchronized event that occurs when certain astronomical alignments coincide with specific social and technological conditions. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about slow evolution or gradual enlightenment. We're talking about a prophetically scheduled moment when human consciousness itself undergoes a fundamental shift. And the most terrifying part, the ancient texts apparently provide the exact timing for when this transformation will begin. A former researcher at the Vatican Observatory, Dr. Maria Castellano, spoke publicly about this just once before her mysterious disappearance in 2021. In a lecture at a small Italian university, she revealed that church astronomers had been tracking celestial events against what she called prophetic astronomical markers for decades. According to her testimony, certain star positions, planetary alignments, and solar activities mentioned in the Forbidden Scrolls were being monitored with the same precision that NASA uses to track satellite launches. Dr. Castellano claimed that Vatican astronomers had identified a specific astronomical configuration that appears in multiple prophetic texts, always associated with the phrase, "when heaven touches earth." This configuration, she said, would occur for the first time in over 3,000 years within the next few years. She wouldn't provide the exact date during her lecture, but she did say that when it happens, the seals that have contained human consciousness will dissolve, and we will remember who we really are. 3 weeks after that lecture, Dr. Castellano vanished from her apartment in Rome. Her research materials disappeared, her computer files were wiped, and Vatican officials claimed she had never been employed at the observatory. But video recordings of her lecture still circulate on obscure corners of the internet, and her words carry the weight of someone who had seen too much and finally decided the truth was more important than her safety. But here's what makes her testimony particularly compelling. The astronomical event she described matches calculations found in texts that have surfaced from completely different sources around the world. Ancient Mayan codices, Tibetan manuscripts, and even fragments recovered from Egyptian tombs all reference the same celestial configuration, using different symbolic languages, but describing identical astronomical mathematics. It's as if cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time all received the same prophetic information and encoded it in their most sacred texts. The only way this makes sense is if there was a single source for these prophecies, a master set of scrolls that was somehow distributed to different civilizations before being systematically suppressed by later religious and political authorities. And that brings us to perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all. According to several independent sources, the original set of prophetic scrolls didn't just predict future events. They contained detailed instructions for how to prepare humanity for the consciousness transformation that was coming. These weren't just prophecies, they were a manual for human evolution. The instructions apparently covered everything from dietary practices and meditation techniques to architectural principles and social structures that would facilitate the awakening process. They described how to build communities that could maintain stability during the transition, how to preserve essential knowledge through periods of chaos, and most importantly, how to recognize and nurture individuals who would serve as guides during the transformation. But when religious authorities realized what they were dealing with, they made a calculated decision. Rather than trust humanity with the complete instructions, they would extract only the prophetic elements while suppressing the practical guidance. They would use their knowledge of the timeline to position themselves as intermediaries between the divine plan and human understanding, maintaining control even as consciousness itself evolved. This explains why fragments of the Forbidden Prophecies keep surfacing in the most unlikely places. The instructions were too important to be completely destroyed, but too dangerous to be openly preserved. So they were hidden in architectural designs, encoded in religious artwork, embedded in musical compositions, and scattered through literary works, where only those who knew what to look for could find them. Consider the Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe. Art historians have long wondered why these massive structures were built with such precise mathematical proportions, incorporating geometric relationships that seem to have no practical purpose. But when you analyze the measurements against the numerical patterns found in prophetic texts, a startling correlation emerges. These cathedrals weren't just churches. They were massive resonance chambers, designed to amplify certain frequencies that, according to the Forbidden Scrolls, would become crucial during the consciousness transformation. The same hidden knowledge appears in Renaissance art, where masters like Michelangelo and Raphael embedded prophetic symbols and mathematical relationships into their most famous works. The Sistine Chapel ceiling isn't just religious storytelling. When analyzed using the numerical codes found in ancient prophecies, it becomes a detailed map of consciousness evolution, with each scene representing a different stage of human awakening. Even modern architecture shows evidence of this hidden influence. Buildings designed by certain architects incorporate proportions and orientations that match patterns described in the cursed scrolls. These structures seem randomly distributed around the world, but when plotted on a map, they form geometric relationships that align with the same astronomical markers referenced in the prophecies. It's as if someone has been preparing the physical world for the transformation described in these forbidden texts, building a network of structures that will somehow facilitate the consciousness shift when the prophetic timeline reaches its culmination. And the most unsettling part is that most of the people involved in this construction probably have no idea what they're really building. The architects receive their inspiration from classical sources. The engineers follow mathematical principles that seem logically sound. The builders construct according to specifications that appear conventional. But the end result is a global infrastructure designed to support a form of human consciousness that doesn't exist yet, built according to instructions that were supposedly destroyed centuries ago. This pattern of hidden influence extends far beyond architecture. When you start looking for it, you find evidence of prophetic knowledge embedded in technological development, political movements, economic systems, and even entertainment media. It's as if the Forbidden Scrolls have been slowly leaking their contents into human culture through channels so subtle that most people never notice the manipulation. Take the internet, for example. The decentralized network structure, the emphasis on information sharing, the global connectivity that allows instant communication across all boundaries. When you compare the development of digital technology against descriptions found in prophetic fragments, the similarities are shocking. Ancient texts that describe thoughts flowing between minds like water and knowledge, becoming accessible to all people, simultaneously read like technical specifications for the World Wide Web. But here's the truly chilling part. If these technological developments are following a prophetic script, then someone with access to the Forbidden Scrolls has been guiding human innovation towards specific goals. The technology we think we invented might actually be the result of carefully orchestrated revelation, with each breakthrough timed to coincide with the overall transformation timeline. And that raises the ultimate question about these cursed scrolls. Are they simply predicting the future, or are they actively shaping it? Because if certain individuals and organizations have been using prophetic knowledge to influence world events for centuries, then everything we think we know about human history, free will, and the nature of reality itself might be fundamentally wrong. The evidence suggests we're not just witnessing the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. We're living inside a carefully orchestrated plan that has been unfolding for thousands of years, guided by knowledge that was supposed to remain buried forever. And according to multiple sources, we're now approaching the moment when that plan reaches its ultimate conclusion. But what happens next? What does the transformation actually look like? And most importantly, are we prepared for what's coming? The answers to these questions lie in the deepest vaults of the Vatican, in private collections guarded by families whose names you've never heard, and in fragments of cursed scrolls that continue to surface despite centuries of suppression. And as we're about to discover, some of those answers are more terrifying than anything we could have imagined. The most disturbing piece of evidence came to light in 2008, when a storage unit in Geneva was abandoned after its owner, an elderly antiquarian named Klaus Zimmermann, died without heirs. Swiss authorities conducting the standard inventory discovered something that should have been impossible. Hidden behind false panels were photocopies of manuscript pages, bearing the official seals of 3 different Vatican archives, documents that, according to church records, had been destroyed in a fire at the Apostolic Archive in 1823. But these weren't just random religious texts. Each page contained prophetic passages that described recent world events with the kind of detail that made seasoned investigators question their own sanity. The manuscripts referenced the exact dates of market crashes, the precise locations where natural disasters would strike, and most unnervingly, the names of political leaders who wouldn't be born for decades after the prophecies were supposedly written. Swiss intelligence quietly confiscated the materials, but not before several pages were photographed by a freelance journalist who had been documenting the estate sale. Those images, which briefly circulated on encrypted forums before being systematically scrubbed from the internet, showed text that read more like military intelligence briefings than religious prophecy. One passage, written in Latin but bearing notations in modern English, described what it called the Great Deception of democratic choice and provided specific voting percentages for elections that hadn't occurred yet. Another section outlined the exact sequence of events that would lead to what it termed the collapse of paper currency systems, complete with dates, market indicators, and the names of financial institutions that would fail in precise order. The journalist who first leaked these images, Sarah Chen, told colleagues that she had been contacted by someone claiming to represent preservation interests within 24 hours of posting the photographs. They offered her what she described as an obscene amount of money for all copies of the materials and her promise to never discuss what she had seen. When she refused, her apartment was burglarized, her computer equipment stolen, and her press credentials mysteriously revoked by multiple news organizations simultaneously. Miss Chen relocated to Thailand, where she continued investigating the connection between prophetic texts and modern intelligence operations. In 2011, she published a single blog post claiming she had identified a network of individuals who were using ancient prophetic knowledge to manipulate global financial markets. She wrote about meeting with a former Deutsche Bank executive who admitted that his most profitable trades had been based on timeline calculations derived from what he called Babylonian scrolls, provided by private consultants whose identities were protected by Vatican banking laws. That blog post was her final communication. Thai authorities found her apartment empty 3 days later, with no signs of struggle but clear evidence that someone had methodically removed every electronic device, document, and personal item that might contain research materials. The official report listed her as a missing person, but unofficial sources suggested she had been relocated through what intelligence professionals call protective extraction protocols. Yet even as investigators like Chen disappeared, the evidence of prophetic manipulation continued mounting. Corporate executives began reporting strange encounters with consultants who possessed impossible foreknowledge of market conditions. Government officials described receiving briefings from advisors who seemed to know the outcomes of international negotiations before they began. Military strategists found themselves working with analysts who could predict enemy movements with accuracy that defied conventional intelligence gathering. All of these advisors shared certain characteristics. They worked through intermediary organizations with names like Historical Analysis Institute or Temporal Strategic Consulting. They never revealed their sources or methods. They demanded payment through cryptocurrency or precious metals rather than traditional banking systems. And they all seemed to have connections to academic institutions, religious organizations, or cultural foundations with ties to Vatican City. Dr. James Whitfield, a former strategic analyst for the Pentagon, broke his non-disclosure agreements in 2015 to describe his experience with one such consulting group. According to his testimony, he was approached by representatives of something called the Kronos Research Foundation, who offered to provide his department with predictive analysis that would exceed current intelligence capabilities by several orders of magnitude. The initial demonstration involved predicting the exact timing and location of 3 separate terrorist incidents that occurred within a 2-week period. The predictions weren't general warnings about increased threat levels. They specified which buildings would be targeted, which groups would claim responsibility, and how many casualties would result from each attack. The accuracy was so precise that Dr. Whitfield's superiors initially suspected the consultants were somehow involved in planning the attacks themselves. But further investigation revealed something more disturbing. The predictions were based on calculations derived from ancient texts that described what the consultants called violence cycles embedded in human consciousness. According to their briefing materials, terrorist activities, wars, and social upheavals follow mathematical patterns that were first mapped by Mesopotamian prophets over 4,000 years ago. Dr. Whitfield described seeing charts that correlated historical violence with astronomical events, population densities, and what the consultants termed collective psychological stress indicators. The mathematics were so complex that even their simplified explanations required advanced degrees in both statistics and psychology to comprehend. But the results were undeniable. By plugging current global conditions into these ancient formulas, the consultants could predict not just when violence would occur, but where it would be most intense and how it would spread. The Pentagon used this information for 3 years, achieving what Dr. Whitfield described as unprecedented success in conflict prevention and resource allocation. But the relationship ended abruptly when military investigators discovered that the same consulting group was providing similar services to intelligence agencies in Russia, China, and several Middle Eastern countries simultaneously. When confronted about this apparent conflict of interest, the consultants' response chilled Dr. Whitfield to his core. They explained that their services weren't designed to give any particular nation an advantage. Their purpose was to ensure that global conflicts unfolded according to what they called prophetic scheduling requirements. They were essentially managing world events to match predictions that had been written thousands of years before any of the current participants were born. Dr. Whitfield's testimony raises perhaps the most terrifying possibility of all. What if the Forbidden Prophecies weren't just predicting future events? What if they were actually instructions for orchestrating those events? And what if there's been a hidden organization following those instructions for centuries, carefully managing human history to ensure that everything unfolds exactly as the cursed scrolls foretold? The evidence for this possibility extends far beyond military consulting. Financial analysts have identified trading patterns that suggest certain investment firms possess advanced knowledge of market movements that can only be explained by access to prophetic information. Pharmaceutical companies have developed drugs for diseases that didn't exist yet, then watched those exact conditions emerge in populations years later. Technology corporations have filed patents for inventions that serve no apparent purpose until global events create demand for precisely those solutions. Consider the career trajectory of Dr. Elena Vasquez, a biochemist who spent 15 years developing what she thought were theoretical treatments for neurological conditions that affected less than 1% of the global population. Her research was funded by grants from organizations she had never heard of, pursuing solutions for problems that seemed largely academic. Then, in 2019, a series of environmental factors began creating neurological symptoms in millions of people worldwide, symptoms that matched exactly the conditions Dr. Vasquez had been studying for over a decade. When questioned about the remarkable coincidence, Dr. Vasquez admitted that her research directions had been guided by what her funders called anticipatory medical protocols. She had been given specific molecular targets to investigate, detailed timelines for research milestones, and even suggestions for manufacturing partnerships that would be needed for mass production of treatments that had no current market demand. Dr. Vasquez's experience mirrors that of hundreds of researchers working in fields ranging from climate science to social psychology. They describe receiving funding for projects that seem disconnected from immediate needs, only to discover years later that their work addresses problems that emerge with perfect timing. It's as if someone with knowledge of future conditions has been positioning scientific solutions in advance, ensuring that when prophetic events unfold, the necessary responses are already available. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this orchestrated approach to human development is what it suggests about individual choice and free will. If major world events are following a predetermined script, and if scientific, technological, and social developments are being guided to support that script, then how much of what we consider human progress is actually authentic innovation versus carefully managed revelation? The question becomes even more complex when you examine the role of what researchers call prophetic bloodlines. Multiple sources have described genealogical records that trace certain family lineages back thousands of years, with notations indicating specific roles that descendants are expected to play in future events. These aren't just royal families or obvious power dynasties. The tracked bloodlines include scientists, artists, religious leaders, and even ordinary citizens who seem to be positioned at critical moments in history. A former genealogist for the Mormon Church, Dr. Rebecca Morrison, spent 12 years working on what she thought was a standard family history project before realizing she was actually mapping something far more sinister. The project, funded by an organization calling itself the Heritage Preservation Society, required her to trace specific genetic lines through centuries of historical records, noting births, deaths, marriages, and geographic relocations with unusual precision. Dr. Morrison initially assumed she was working on a comprehensive genetic study or perhaps an elaborate ancestry service for wealthy clients. But as she delved deeper into the records, she began noticing patterns that defied statistical probability. Descendants of certain bloodlines consistently appeared at pivotal moments in history, often in positions that allowed them to influence the outcome of major events. She found artists whose works shaped cultural movements, appearing in the right place at precisely the right time. Scientists making breakthrough discoveries exactly when those discoveries were needed for the next phase of technological development. Religious leaders emerging to guide spiritual movements that aligned perfectly with social and political changes occurring simultaneously. The mathematical probability of these coincidences occurring naturally was so low that Dr. Morrison began investigating the source materials that guided her research. What she discovered was a collection of genealogical charts that predated many of the historical records she was using to verify them. Someone had been tracking these bloodlines for centuries, not to document family histories, but to ensure that specific genetic traits and capabilities would be available when the unfolding prophetic timeline required them. Dr. Morrison's investigation led her to what she described as the most comprehensive breeding program in human history, a multi-generational effort to cultivate individuals with the precise psychological, intellectual, and spiritual characteristics needed to fulfill roles described in the Forbidden Prophecies. The program didn't rely on crude genetic manipulation. Instead, it used carefully arranged marriages, strategic relocations, and selective education to guide bloodlines toward producing individuals who would instinctively make choices that served the prophetic agenda. When Dr. Morrison attempted to publish her findings, she discovered that her employment contract contained clauses that granted her former employer ownership of all research materials and prohibited her from discussing her work without written permission. Legal challenges revealed that similar restrictions had been placed on hundreds of researchers working on related projects, creating a web of enforced silence around the entire genealogical mapping effort. But Dr. Morrison's research had already revealed something that made her question the nature of human identity itself. According to the records she had studied, the prophetic bloodlines didn't just produce individuals who would influence major events. They were specifically designed to create people who would experience what the ancient texts called awakening moments, at precisely the times when the consciousness transformation described in the Forbidden Scrolls would require guides, teachers. These awakening moments weren't random spiritual experiences. They were apparently triggered by specific combinations of genetic predisposition, environmental conditions, and astronomical influences that had been calculated centuries in advance. The individuals experiencing these awakenings would suddenly possess knowledge and abilities they had never learned, insights into reality that seemed to come from outside their normal consciousness, and an irresistible compulsion to share these revelations with others. Dr. Morrison realized she was looking at evidence of what could only be described as a prophetic artificial intelligence system, one that used human genetics, social engineering, and environmental manipulation to create exactly the right individuals at exactly the right times to guide humanity through the transformation process described in the Cursed Scrolls. The implications were staggering. If this system had been operating for centuries, then human history wasn't the result of random events and individual choices. It was the product of a carefully managed program designed to prepare our species for a fundamental change in consciousness, with every major development serving as a stepping stone toward that ultimate goal. And according to Dr. Morrison's calculations based on the genealogical patterns she had studied, we were now living through the final generation of this breeding program. The bloodlines had converged, the environmental conditions were aligning, and the individuals who were meant to guide humanity through its transformation were beginning to experience their prophetically scheduled awakenings. But what form would this transformation actually take? And were we prepared for the reality of what these forbidden prophecies had been building toward for thousands of years? The answers to these questions were about to emerge from the most unexpected source imaginable. not from ancient scrolls or Vatican archives, but from the rapidly developing field of quantum consciousness research, where scientists were beginning to discover that the human mind possessed capabilities that had been deliberately suppressed for millennia, capabilities that matched exactly what the cursed prophecies had predicted would emerge during the final phase of human evolution. And that's where our investigation takes its most shocking turn. Because in laboratories around the world, quantum physicists have begun documenting phenomena that sound like they were ripped directly from the pages of these forbidden scrolls. Dr. Michael Chen, a quantum consciousness researcher at the Institute for Advanced Physics in Vienna, has spent the last 8 years studying what he calls non-local awareness events. These are documented cases where individuals suddenly gain access to information that exists outside the normal boundaries of space and time. Knowledge they couldn't possibly have acquired through conventional means, yet which proves accurate in ways that defy every known law of physics. What makes Dr. Chen's research particularly relevant to our investigation is that these non-local awareness events don't occur randomly. They follow patterns that correlate with astronomical cycles, genetic markers, and environmental conditions that match the prophetic calculations found in ancient texts. It's as if human consciousness has been programmed with dormant capabilities that activate according to a predetermined schedule. In year-old Liber 1 documented case, a 34-Arian in Portland suddenly began experiencing what she described as memory downloads during the solar eclipse of 2017. Over a period of 3 weeks, she produced over 400 pages of mathematical equations describing the relationship between consciousness and quantum field fluctuations. When submitted to peer review, these equations were found to solve several fundamental problems in theoretical physics that had puzzled scientists for decades. The librarian had no background in mathematics beyond high school algebra. She couldn't explain where the knowledge came from, describing it as remembering things I never learned. But brain scans conducted during her episodes showed neural activity patterns that resembled what researchers see in individuals accessing long-term memories, not creating new thoughts. Dr. Chen has documented over 200 similar cases worldwide. Engineers suddenly designing technologies that won't be commercially viable for another decade. Musicians composing pieces that incorporate mathematical relationships found only in ancient prophetic texts. Even children drawing complex diagrams that match archaeological discoveries they couldn't possibly know about. What connects all these cases is timing. The non-local awareness events began increasing dramatically around 2012, reached a significant spike during the 2017 eclipse, and have been accelerating exponentially ever since. Dr. Chen's data shows that we're currently experiencing these consciousness anomalies at a rate 17 times higher than the baseline measurements from just 5 years ago. But here's where the story becomes truly terrifying. Dr. Chen's research wasn't originally designed to study consciousness at all. He was investigating quantum field fluctuations for a project funded by what he thought was a telecommunications company interested in improving satellite communications. Only after 3 years of collecting data did he realize that his research was being guided toward discoveries that had already been predicted in texts he wasn't supposed to know existed. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chen attended a conference in Prague and met Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a researcher from Tokyo who had been studying similar phenomena from a completely different angle. Dr. Tanaka had been investigating what she called genetic memory activation, cases where individuals suddenly gained access to knowledge that seemed to be encoded in their DNA rather than learned through experience. When they compared their findings, the two researchers realized they were studying the same phenomenon from different perspectives. The non-local awareness events weren't random occurrences. They were the activation of information that had been embedded in human consciousness at the genetic level, programmed to emerge when specific environmental and astronomical conditions aligned. Dr. Tanaka had traced these genetic memory patterns back through family lineages spanning centuries. She discovered that the ability to experience awareness events was inherited, passed down through specific bloodlines that could be traced to ancient populations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and other regions where the earliest prophetic texts originated. Even more disturbing, Dr. Tanaka's research suggested that these genetic memory patterns weren't natural evolutionary developments. The mathematical precision of their inheritance patterns and the complexity of the information they contained indicated deliberate programming by an intelligence that understood human genetics at a level that modern science is only beginning to approach. Together, Chen and Tanaka developed what they called the prophetic consciousness model, a framework suggesting that human awareness has been artificially constrained for thousands of years, with predetermined trigger points designed to release expanded capabilities when the species reached specific developmental milestones. According to their model, we're not just experiencing random consciousness anomalies. We're witnessing the systematic activation of dormant human potential that was programmed into our genetics by whoever created the original prophetic texts. The Forbidden Scrolls weren't just predicting future events. They were describing the implementation schedule for a consciousness upgrade that had been embedded in human DNA from the beginning. But when Chen and Tanaka attempted to publish their joint research, they encountered the same pattern of suppression that has silenced so many other investigators. Their university funding was suddenly redirected to other projects. Peer reviewers rejected their papers with criticisms that seemed deliberately obtuse. Conference invitations were mysteriously withdrawn. Most ominously, both researchers began receiving visits from individuals claiming to represent various academic and government organizations. These visitors didn't threaten or intimidate. Instead, they offered lucrative research positions at prestigious institutions with the understanding that their consciousness research would be discontinued in favor of more practical applications of quantum physics. Dr. Chen accepted one of these offers and relocated to a private research facility in Switzerland, where he now works on classified projects he cannot discuss. Dr. Tanaka refused the offers and found herself increasingly isolated from the academic community, her research dismissed as pseudoscience despite its rigorous methodology and documented results. But before their separation, Chen and Tanaka made one final discovery that explains why their research posed such a threat to established authorities. They identified what they called consciousness cascade points, specific moments in the near future when the number of humans experiencing awareness events would reach critical mass, triggering a collective awakening that would be impossible to suppress or control. According to their calculations, we're approaching the first cascade point within the next few years. When it occurs, millions of people worldwide will simultaneously gain access to expanded consciousness capabilities, including the ability to perceive information across time and space, to communicate telepathically, and most importantly, to see through the deceptions and manipulations that have controlled human society for centuries. The Forbidden Prophecies apparently describe this moment as the breaking of the seals, when human consciousness breaks free from its artificial constraints and remembers its true nature. But they also warn that those who have benefited from humanity's limited awareness won't surrender their control without a fight. Ancient texts describe a period of intense chaos and conflict as the old systems of control collapse and new forms of human organization emerge. The prophecies suggest that this transition period will test humanity's wisdom and compassion, determining whether our species evolves into something greater or destroys itself in the process of awakening. And that brings us to perhaps the most crucial revelation hidden in these cursed scrolls. The consciousness transformation isn't just about individual awakening. It's about the emergence of what the prophecies call collective intelligence, a form of shared awareness that would unite human consciousness into a single, interconnected network spanning the entire planet. This collective intelligence wouldn't eliminate individual identity, but it would make deception, manipulation, and exploitation virtually impossible. Every thought, every intention, every action would be transparent to the collective awareness. Lies couldn't survive in an environment where truth was immediately apparent to everyone. Corruption would be instantly detected and corrected. Violence would become unthinkable when you could feel the suffering it caused as if it were your own. But for those whose power depends on keeping humanity divided, ignorant, and controllable, the emergence of collective intelligence represents an existential threat. They would lose not just their authority, but their ability to exist as separate entities pursuing selfish interests at the expense of others. The Forbidden Prophecies describe various strategies that the controllers would use to prevent or delay this awakening. They would create artificial crises to distract humanity from its spiritual development. They would promote technologies that fragment attention and weaken the capacity for deep contemplation. They would spread confusion and fear to keep people focused on survival rather than evolution. Most insidiously, they would attempt to co-opt the awakening process itself, creating false spiritual movements that would channel humanity's expanding awareness in directions that served the controllers' interests rather than genuine evolution. But the prophecies also reveal something that gives reason for hope. The consciousness transformation isn't dependent on human effort or permission. It's encoded into the fundamental structure of reality itself, triggered by cosmic cycles that operate beyond the reach of earthly authority. The controllers can delay or complicate the process, but they cannot stop it entirely. We're living through the final phase of a cosmic program that was initiated when the first prophetic texts were written. Every major event in human history has been building toward this moment, when our species either transcends its limitations or fails to meet the challenge of its own evolution. And according to multiple sources who claim knowledge of the complete prophetic timeline, we don't have long to wait. The astronomical alignments, genetic activations, and social conditions necessary for the Great Awakening are converging rapidly. Within the next few years, we'll discover whether humanity is ready for the transformation that has been predicted for millennia, or whether we'll need additional cycles of learning before we're prepared to embrace our true potential. But one thing is certain: the forbidden prophecies that were buried to keep humanity in darkness are now surfacing everywhere, shared through digital networks that the ancient controllers never anticipated. The seals that contained this knowledge for centuries are breaking, and the truth that was meant to remain hidden is flowing into human consciousness like water through cracks in a crumbling dam. The question is no longer whether these revelations will emerge. The question is whether we'll have the wisdom to understand them and the courage to act on what they reveal about our destiny as a species. Because according to these cursed scrolls, we're not just approaching the end of an age, we're approaching the beginning of what human consciousness was always meant to become. And the transformation starts not with the awakening of humanity as a whole, but with the awakening of individuals who are brave enough to look beyond the comfortable lies they've been told and confront the magnificent, terrifying truth of what we really are. The forbidden prophecies weren't buried to protect us from dangerous knowledge. They were buried to prevent us from remembering the power we possessed all along. And now, as these ancient secrets surface in the most unlikely places, we're being forced to confront a question that will determine the future of human civilization. Are we ready to become who we were always meant to be? The answer may lie in something that happened just 18 months ago, something that sent shockwaves through the highest levels of global intelligence agencies, yet never made a single headline in mainstream media. It began with a routine archaeological survey in the Judean hills, where ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomaly beneath what appeared to be a natural rock formation. The initial excavation team consisted of graduate students from Hebrew University working under a modest grant from what they believed was a cultural preservation foundation. What they uncovered in that first week of digging defied every protocol they had been taught. Buried beneath 12 feet of carefully arranged stone layers was a sealed chamber containing scrolls wrapped in metallic sheeting that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world. But here's where the story takes an ominous turn that reveals just how closely these forbidden texts are still being monitored. Within 72 hours of the discovery, the excavation site was visited by representatives from organizations the students had never heard of: Cultural Heritage Protection Agency, International Archaeological Verification Committee, Mediterranean Historical Preservation Society. Each group carried official-looking credentials and polite explanations for why the materials needed to be relocated for proper analysis. The lead graduate student, whose name I cannot reveal for obvious reasons, managed to photograph several fragments before the site was secured. Those images, which briefly circulated in encrypted academic forums before being systematically removed, showed text written in multiple languages arranged in parallel columns, as if someone had been creating a translation key for future readers who might not understand the original scripts. One fragment, photographed in sufficient detail to allow partial translation, contained what appeared to be a timeline marking specific years in the 21st century, alongside descriptions of consciousness barriers dissolving and the awakening of sleeping minds. Another fragment showed diagrams that resembled neural network patterns, with notations suggesting these represented the structure of what the text called collective human awareness. Most disturbing of all was a fragment that contained recognizable names of current world leaders, their birth dates, and cryptic notations about their roles in something called the final preparation phase. The text suggested these individuals had been positioned in their current roles not through political ambition or democratic processes, but as part of a predetermined sequence designed to create the exact conditions necessary for consciousness transformation. The graduate student who photographed these fragments described feeling physically ill while reading them, not because the content was disturbing, but because the information seemed to bypass his rational mind and trigger what he could only describe as cellular recognition. He claimed the scrolls contained knowledge that felt familiar rather than foreign, as if he was remembering rather than learning. Within a week of those photographs surfacing online, the graduate student experienced what appeared to be a complete personality change. Colleagues described him becoming withdrawn, speaking in cryptic phrases about prophetic fulfillment schedules and timeline convergence protocols. He abandoned his doctoral program and relocated to a remote monastery in Greece, where he reportedly spends his days in silent meditation, claiming he is preparing to receive final instructions. But the implications of what was found in that Judean chamber extend far beyond one student's apparent psychological breakdown. The scrolls he photographed match descriptions of texts that have surfaced at archaeological sites around the world over the past 2 years, all discovered in circumstances that follow the same suspicious pattern of academic investigation followed by immediate suppression. A dig site in Peru yielded fragments describing genetic memory activation sequences timed to coincide with specific solar activity patterns. Excavations beneath a medieval church in Romania uncovered texts referencing consciousness cascade events that would begin when global communication networks reached a certain level of interconnectedness. Even underwater archaeology off the coast of Japan has produced sealed containers holding scrolls that describe the awakening protocol in language that sounds more like computer programming than religious prophecy. What connects all these discoveries is not just their similar content, but their identical preservation methods. Each cache was sealed using techniques that prevented degradation for thousands of years, as if whoever created them knew exactly when they would be found and wanted to ensure the information remained intact until that predetermined moment. Dr. Sarah Lindemann, a materials scientist who analyzed samples from 3 different sites before her research was classified, described preservation methods that incorporated elements that shouldn't have been available to ancient civilizations. Metallic compounds that resisted oxidation, organic polymers that prevented biological decay, and most puzzling of all, crystalline structures that seemed designed to protect the scrolls from electromagnetic interference. According to Dr. Lindemann's analysis, these weren't just storage containers, they were time capsules engineered to release their contents when specific environmental conditions aligned. The seals would only break when atmospheric electromagnetic levels reached certain thresholds, when solar radiation patterns matched predetermined parameters, or when the containers detected specific frequencies that wouldn't exist until global communication systems achieved particular configurations. Dr. Lindemann's research suggested that whoever created these time capsules possessed not only advanced knowledge of materials science, but also precise understanding of how human technology would develop over thousands of years. They knew exactly when digital networks would reach the complexity needed to disseminate prophetic information globally, and they timed the release of their hidden scrolls to coincide with that moment. But Dr. Lindemann's research was terminated abruptly when government investigators discovered that her analysis methods had been suggested by consultants from the same mysterious organizations that had been appearing at archaeological sites worldwide. She realized she hadn't been conducting independent research. She had been following a predetermined protocol designed to analyze materials that someone already knew would be discovered. The implications are staggering. Not only have these forbidden prophecies been systematically buried throughout history, but their excavation and analysis are being carefully managed by the same forces that originally suppressed them. The scrolls are being allowed to surface now because their contents serve the current phase of whatever plan has been unfolding for millennia. This controlled revelation explains why fragments of prophetic knowledge have been appearing in scientific research, technological development, and even entertainment media with increasing frequency. The information isn't leaking randomly. It's being strategically released to prepare human consciousness for revelations that would be too shocking if disclosed all at once. What we've uncovered tonight isn't just history, it's a living program that's been running in the background of human civilization for thousands of years. These forbidden prophecies weren't buried because they were false. They were buried because they revealed a truth so profound, so transformative, that those in power knew it would shatter every system of control they'd built. But prophecy, like water, always finds a way. The seals are breaking, the scrolls are surfacing, and we're rapidly approaching the moment when humanity remembers what it was always meant to become.